Some wars are fought on the battlefield, others in the shadows, where reason and the supernatural intertwine in ways that defy human understanding. In the heart of Germany, standing atop centuries of blood and mystery, lies Wewelsburg, a castle that became the epicenter of something far greater than military strategy. Heinrich Himmler, obsessed with Germanic mysticism and the vision of a divine Aryan order, turned this place into more than a symbol of the Reich. He made it a dark temple. They say that deep within Wewelsburg, beyond cold stone corridors and locked doors whose reasons remain unquestioned, unnameable rituals were performed by the SS's most devoted officers. A circle of 12 men gathered around a black emblem, chanted incantations ripped from manuscripts lost to time. But some things should never be awakened. Soldiers and villagers whispered of shadows that moved without light, of whispers in dead, languages echoing through empty halls, and of an invisible presence that made the air unbearably cold. When the Allies finally took the castle, they found more than just Nazi documents and relics. They discovered human skulls etched with runic symbols, pagan artifacts used in rituals, and disturbing records that spoke of spiritual contact with Aryan ancestors. The castle was sealed, but some doors were never meant to be opened again. October 1945. The war was over. But no one walks out of hell without bringing something back with them. Some carried scars, others carried secrets, and then there were those who brought back things that should have never been found. I was in the second group. My name is Jonathan Hayes, captain of Unit Fenrir. If you've never heard of it, that's because it officially never existed. The mission sounded simple on paper: recovery of classified occultist materials of strategic interest. But we all knew the truth. It was just a polished way of saying we were hunting down the dirty remains of the SS. It was late October when I received the order. Wewelsburg, a medieval castle turned into the SS's esoteric headquarters. Heinrich Himmler believed that place was the spiritual heart of the Reich. He conducted rituals, hand-picked SS officers as if they were Templar knights in some secret cult. Officially, the Allies had already swept the castle months before. British officers catalogued books, destroyed Nazi symbols, and seized documents. But something was still there. Something that should have never been left behind. That's how my team and I ended up standing before that sinister fortress, in the middle of a frozen forest lost in time, under a gray, lifeless sky. Before we departed, an aging British officer met us at the forward base in Paderborn. A MI6 veteran, pale-skinned and hollow-eyed. When he saw us, he didn't look relieved. He looked regretful. "I was there, Captain," he said, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "We swept the place, took the documents, locked the doors. But some things should have stayed buried." I didn't reply. I waited for him to continue. He looked at me and then at Evelyn, the only civilian on the mission. For a brief moment, he seemed to consider stopping her from going. "If there are locked doors in that castle," he muttered, "maybe it's best to leave them that way." Evelyn frowned. Logan, our sergeant, smirked. But I only had one question. "What did you see in there?" The old man took a slow drag of his cigarette, exhaled the smoke, and said, "It's not what we saw, Captain. It's what we heard." Then he got up and walked away without another word. That was the only warning that might have kept us alive. The road to Wewelsburg was a thin, winding cut through a silent forest. No birds, no wind, only the crunch of the Jeep's tires on loose gravel. When the castle finally came into view, it was like staring at a stone tomb. The black towers rose against the storm-heavy sky, claws reaching to tear the clouds apart. The place was solid, unmoving, yet somehow it felt alive. The first thing I noticed was the unnatural cold. It wasn't just the weather. It clung to the skin, sank into the bones. Like the very air itself was rejecting us. Will stepped out of the Jeep, scanning the area, his eyes narrowing. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Neither do I admitted. We walked through that gate without realizing we had already crossed an invisible threshold. That something inside that castle already knew we were there. and that none of us were getting out unscathed. The silence was the first thing that unsettled me. The village near Wewelsburg felt frozen in time. Some houses were shut tight, their windows covered with thick curtains. The few people we saw, stooped old men and women in dark headscarves, quickly turned away the moment they noticed our presence. It wasn't fear of foreigners. It was something deeper, shame, guilt, or maybe a very old secret. A boy, no older than 8, watched us from a narrow alley. When I started to lift my hand to wave, his mother yanked him back, whispering something in German before disappearing inside. Logan spat on the ground. This shit's not right. I felt it too, but we kept moving. Wewelsburg Castle rose before us like a giant tombstone, black against the ashen sky. It was cold, not the kind that came from the wind, but from the place itself. Will adjusted his backpack, glancing at Evelyn. History says this place is cursed, that even before the Nazis, bad things happened here. Evelyn didn't respond. She just stared at the sharp, pointed towers, as if she could feel something inside watching us. As soon as we crossed the gate, a bitter wind cut through us, too strong, too sudden to be natural, and for just a second, I swear I heard something in that wind. Whispers. I turned to Logan, but he just shook his head. He heard it too. Inside, the air was thick with mold, rotting wood, and rust. But there was something else, a metallic scent. Blood, not fresh. Old. The stone walls were scarred, covered in ancient Germanic runes, symbols of protection and war. Some had been hastily scratched out, as if someone had tried to destroy them. What the hell is this? Will muttered, pointing to a burned emblem on the floor of the main hall. Evelyn knelt down, brushing away some of the soot with her fingers. It was the SS insignia. Someone tried to erase all traces of it. Logan frowned. But why? The Allies took this place months ago. Why would someone burn it afterward? No one answered. Then, as we examined the scorched markings, the wind howled again, rushing through the corridors of the castle. Cold, icy, and it carried something with it. Whispers, and this time words. We found the library in the lower levels, inside a half-open iron vault. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of old paper and wet leather. Evelyn pulled out a dusty file and began translating the titles. Project Schwarze Sonne, The Key of Wewelsburg, Experiments with the Spiritual Veil. She stopped and swallowed hard. Incomplete ritual. A suffocating silence settled over us. Only the rustling of paper filled the room. Then Will whispered, "What the hell were they trying to do here?" Evelyn turned the page, her eyes widening. I leaned in, reading over her shoulder. It was a report dated March 1945. The attempt at contact failed. The ritual was interrupted. One of them remained. There was something else, a final line scribbled in a trembling hand. We sealed the door. May God forgive us. Then we heard it, a sharp, dry sound from the hallway behind us, like something had just moved, and we were no longer alone. We spent the entire afternoon digging through documents, photographing symbols, and trying to make sense of what the Nazis had really done inside that place. But something was off. The cold inside the castle wasn't natural. Neither was the silence, and definitely not the unsettling feeling that no matter where we were, someone was watching. By nightfall, we set up camp inside the castle. The generators hummed, giving us just enough power to keep the main halls dimly lit. Logan was the first to notice. Has anyone seen Wilkins? Private Wilkins, one of our most experienced men, quiet, disciplined, not the kind of guy to wander off without a word, but he wasn't there. We searched everywhere, room after room, floor after floor. Nothing, no sign of a struggle, no trail to follow. Then we found his rifle in the Great Hall. The weapon was loaded, the safety off. It looked like he dropped it in an instant, and then Logan saw it. What the hell? Wilkins's left boot, sitting perfectly upright on the stone floor, with his foot still inside. The cut was clean, precise. No blood. Like he had simply vanished from inside his own uniform. His radio was next to it, still working. Logan picked it up, hesitating for only a moment before switching it on. A wave of static. Then, a slow, heavy breath. Someone was on the other end. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, the breathing stopped. A few seconds of complete silence. And then, a voice. Hoarse. Distorted. "You're too late." Back in the library, Evelyn sat hunched over an old Nazi journal. The leather cover was cracked. The German handwriting rushed and uneven, like it had been written in fear. She began translating, her voice barely above a whisper. "They told us it was just a ritual, that we would open a door and speak to our ancestors. But the shadows speak to us and the dead walk among us." She turned the page. The handwriting became more frantic. "We sealed the door, but it's still here." Evelyn looked up at me. "Captain, what exactly happened in this castle?" The only way to find out was to understand the castle itself. I grabbed an old German floor plan from the archives, scanning over it carefully. Wewelsburg had 3 floors above ground. The records confirmed 2 levels of underground chambers. But then, I noticed something. The library we were standing in had been built over a 3rd level. A level that didn't exist on any official map. Something was beneath this castle. Will exhaled sharply. "Do we really want to know what it is?" Before I could answer, we heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Dragging. We moved out of the library, weapons raised, scanning the hallway, looking for Wilkins or for whatever had taken him. The corridor was empty, but on the cold, damp stone floor, there were footprints. Bare footprints. Coming from nowhere. The underground chambers of Wewelsburg weren't supposed to exist, at least not officially. I had been inside dozens of Nazi fortresses, some hidden so well the world might never find them. But this place, this was different. When Logan forced open the iron door at the back of the library, a rotten, suffocating wind rushed out from the castle's depths. The smell was all wrong. Damp stone, mold, rusted iron, but also rotting flesh. And it wasn't from rats. The chamber wasn't on any official maps. We descended slowly, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness, illuminating runes carved into the walls. Dunifaded rushed, like someone had tried to contain something, and failed. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, we found the heart of the darkness. The subterranean hall was circular, vast but suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around us. At the center, there was a massive black circle burned into the floor. Not paint, flesh-charred stone. Like something had been incinerated there. Scattered around the room were 12 human skulls, etched with arcane symbols. Nazi skulls. Evelyn knelt beside one, her trembling fingers tracing the runes. This isn't just Germanic symbology," she whispered. Will swallowed hard. "Then what the hell is it?" She hesitated. "Something much older, something that should have never been touched." And that's when the cold deepened. My fingers went numb. I could see our breath misting in the air. This wasn't psychological. This wasn't a draft of wind. The room itself was growing colder. Then, we heard it. Behind us. A voice. Weak. Hoarse. Begging. "Captain?" My blood turned to ice. "Wilkins." I spun around so fast I nearly slipped on the cold stone. Will and Logan raised their weapons, but there was nothing there. Only shadows. Flickering, shifting, moving on their own. Then, the voice came again. Closer. "Captain, help me." Evelyn was shaking now. "That's not Wilkins." The voice twisted, distorted. What had started as a weak whisper became a deep, dissonant echo, like something very old was learning to speak our language. "Help me." Logan's flashlight flickered, and for a fraction of a second, something was there. Something twisted, gaunt, its skin blackened like burned leather. But then we blinked and it was gone, leaving behind only silence and the cold. A deep, unnatural cold. I couldn't tell how long we'd been down there. Minutes, hours, days? My watch had stopped. Logan's too. Will's watch spun out of control, like time itself no longer followed the rules inside this castle. And the cold only got worse. This wasn't the chill of an autumn night. It was deeper, heavier, like the air itself was sick. Our footsteps echoed too loudly in the stone corridors, as if invisible versions of ourselves were following. And with every shadow, our lanterns cast against the walls, something felt wrong. Then we heard the first sound, a weak whisper coming from Logan's radio. We were gathered in the library trying to decipher the castle's records when his radio crackled. We all froze. The radio was off, but the static grew louder, and then a low, rasping voice spoke in German. Sie sind nicht allein. Evelyn's eyes widened. You are not alone. The radio slipped off the table, but the voice kept speaking, even after it hit the floor. The frequency shifted. We heard footsteps, heavy boots, marching, a dry, rhythmic sound echoing through the castle's silence, and then another whisper, closer. This time, "Seid bereit." Evelyn covered her mouth. "Prepare yourselves." The radio went dead. Nobody moved. The only thing breaking the silence was the sound of our own breathing. Then Logan muttered, "Does anyone else feel like we're being hunted?" Shortly after, Wilkes, one of our soldiers, returned from patrolling the corridors. He was pale, sweating. I saw someone. My stomach twisted. Who? Wilkes ran a trembling hand over his face. I was heading down the second-floor hallway when I saw a man standing in the dark, a Nazi uniform. But something was wrong. Wrong how? I asked. He hesitated. He was smiling. But the smile was too wide, too big for a human face, like his mouth had been carved open from ear to ear, and his eyes. He took a shaky breath. They were completely white. A cold shiver crawled up my spine. Then, "What?" Wilkes swallowed. My flashlight flickered, and he was gone. We stood in silence. Wilkes's heavy breathing was the only sound in the room. Then, Will broke the tension. "This has gone too far, Captain. We need to get the hell out of here." But before I could respond, Evelyn turned another page in the Nazi journal. She gasped. "Oh my God. What is it?" I asked. Her hands shook as she read aloud. "If you hear the voices, do not answer. If you see one of the 12, do not look them in the eyes." Logan's lantern flickered. A gust of wind swept through the corridor, and then we heard something crawling in the dark, right behind us. It was playing with us. Every step inside that castle made us question whether we were still awake or trapped in some kind of rotting, feverish nightmare. But the mirror was the worst part. Will was the one who found it first. We were searching the second-floor chambers when he called out, "Hey guys, there's something weird here." The room looked like an old SS officer's office. Dark wooden furniture covered in dust, empty bookshelves, and a large gold-framed mirror leaning against the wall. But the glass was fogged over, like someone had just breathed on it. Curious, Will wiped it with his hand and froze. I saw the exact moment something inside him broke. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. He was trembling, staring at the mirror like he had seen a monster. Then he staggered backward so fast he knocked over a table. It wasn't me. "What?" Will looked at me, pale. I didn't smile. I moved closer and looked into the mirror. The glass was now clear. I saw my own reflection, and for a brief second, I almost sighed in relief. But then, I saw something else. Wilkins, standing behind me, along with the other missing soldiers. Their uniforms were torn, their bodies thin, pale, their eyes dark and empty. A chill crawled up my spine. I turned instinctively. Nothing. The room was empty. But when I looked back at the mirror, they were still there. And then, the glass cracked. That night was hell. Logan woke up at 3:37 a.m. feeling something heavy pressing on his chest. He turned to the side and saw McNamara standing outside his bed. Except, he wasn't standing. McNamara was floating, His feet hovered inches above the floor. His body twisted unnaturally, as if something invisible was squeezing his neck. His lips trembled. He was whispering something. Logan swallowed hard. "Mac!" He stepped closer. McNamara's eyes were rolled back. His mouth muttered a low, repetitive sound, a prayer, but not in Latin, not in German, not in any language Logan had ever heard. Then, McNamara's head snapped to the side at an impossible angle, and he looked directly at him. Logan's breath caught. McNamara tried to speak, but the only thing that came out was a dry, empty sigh. And then, without warning, his body collapsed, like a dried-up corpse, his skin shriveled like parchment, his eyes sunken, his mouth frozen in a scream no one had heard. And then from somewhere deep inside the castle, someone laughed. No one slept after what happened to McNamara. His body didn't decay like a normal corpse. It dried up, like every drop of liquid had been drained from him in seconds. The team's medic had no explanation. And the worst part? The radio still picked up his breathing. That was enough to make a decision. We had to get out of that castle. But before we left, I needed to know exactly what we were facing. That's how we found the door. The entrance was hidden behind a bookshelf in the library, a secret passage, a path that was never meant to be found. We descended slowly, boots scraping against the stone steps. The smell was unbearable. Rust, dampness, and something rotten. And then, at the bottom of the tunnel, we saw the door. It was massive, solid iron, sealed with thick chains and rusted nails. But what really made my blood run cold were the marks on the stone surrounding it, deep scratches carved into the surface like claw marks from the inside, trying to get out. Evelyn pointed to an inscription above the door. Her face was pale as paper. "Here lies the 13th. The silence was suffocating. I felt a deep primal fear crawl into my bones. "The 13th what?" Logan asked. Evelyn didn't answer. She just kept staring at the door, like something was staring back. That's when Will whispered, "There's something behind that door." The way he said it, it wasn't a guess, he knew. And then everything spiraled out of control. One of the soldiers started acting strange. Parker, a tough ex-Marine, the kind of man who hadn't shown a single sign of fear since we stepped into that castle. But now, he was shaking and his eyes weren't his anymore. "Parker?" Will called out. Nothing, and then he moved toward the door. "Don't touch that," I shouted, but he didn't stop. He muttered something, low, unintelligible, like a forgotten prayer. His veins bulged, skin stretched tight, and his eyes black, bottomless. We grabbed him before he could touch the chains. He fought back, with a strength that wasn't his, and then the voice came from the darkness. It wasn't Parker's. It wasn't anyone's. It was deep, wrong. Something that shouldn't exist, and it said clear as a funeral bell, "You have come too far." And then, the door began to shake. It shook, and the chains groaned, like something on the other side was growing impatient. Parker was still frozen, his eyes empty, his lips mumbling a language none of us had ever heard. That's when Logan pointed behind us. The shadows. They're moving. The ground trembled. Our flashlights flickered. At first, it was just a low hum, then a deep resonating sound vibrating inside our skulls, like something was trying to push through. The air became heavy, rotten. I had to force myself to breathe just to keep from suffocating. And then, it came out of the darkness. I have seen the worst of humanity. I have seen bodies piled in mass graves, soldiers burned to ash by artillery fire. But nothing compared to what emerged from that tunnel. At first, it was just a blur of shadows that shouldn't have been there. The space around it twisted like the castle itself was rejecting it. And then, it took form. It was human. And at the same time, it wasn't. Its skin was black as scorched coal, cracked like it was constantly burning. But there were no flames, only cold. Its body was never the same. It broke apart and reformed with every second. its limbs stretching into impossible shapes before snapping back. But the worst part? The face. It kept changing. One moment, it was a Nazi officer, then a child, then a rotting corpse, and for a moment, it was Wilkins, then McNamara, both dead, but standing right there like they had never disappeared. And then, it smiled. Its teeth were wrong, too small, too many. And when it spoke, it wasn't one voice, it was many. A chorus of whispers speaking all at once. You opened the wrong door. The sound came from every direction, and then it moved. Fire! The corridor erupted in gunfire. Bullets passed through it. There was no flesh to hit. It was like shooting at frozen air, but alive. Parker collapsed to the ground, finally free from whatever had taken hold of him. His body shook, like he had been drained from the inside. But the entity didn't stop. It glided forward, never touching the ground. Too fast. Distorted. Like reality itself was breaking around it. I tried to move back, but my body felt heavy. The floor beneath me pulled at my feet, like the castle was trying to swallow us whole. This wasn't supposed to be here, Evelyn screamed. The thing turned its face toward her, and for the first time, it paused. The only thing that had slowed it down was the truth. They didn't call the ancestors, Evelyn shouted. They called something else. The creature's mouth stretched into an impossible grin, and then the entire castle shook. It moved forward, not running, gliding. The air warped around it, twisting like heat rising from a corpse. The lights flickered, the ground trembled, and my mind screamed for me to run, to escape, to get out of there. But we knew. There was nowhere left to go. If we didn't end this now, we were never leaving that castle. The ritual, Evelyn shouted, gripping the Nazi journal with trembling hands. We have to reverse the process. Something clicked in my head. If they had opened this thing with an incomplete ritual, then maybe the only way to stop it was to finish it in reverse. But the problem was time, because it was already on top of us. Logan moved first. He tore open his canteen, dipped his fingers into the water, and started drawing symbols on the floor. Tell me this is gonna work, he shouted, frantically scratching lines onto the stone. Evelyn flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the scribbled handwriting. She found the right passage, but her voice faltered. Evelyn, hurry! Will yelled, backing away as the air around us began to rot. I could smell it, like burned flesh, and something else. Something that shouldn't have a smell at all. The creature stopped in the middle of the chamber. For a moment I thought we had done it. And then, it opened its mouth, and every voice that had ever died in that castle screamed at once. The first crack split the floor open. Right down the center of the room, a deep black fracture slicing through the stone, like the castle itself was breaking apart. But inside, there was no rock, no dirt, no foundation, just a void. A churning abyss of liquid darkness, spiraling like a giant watching eye. It stared up at us, watching as we desperately tried to save our own lives. The creature's voice distorted, the screams merging, clashing, unraveling, like it was being dragged into the same nightmare it had helped create. But it wasn't going down without a fight. The floor collapsed beneath Will. He screamed, hands grabbing at anything he could. I threw myself forward, catching his arm before he disappeared forever. Pull me up! Jonathan, pull me up! His eyes were wide, staring into the darkness below. I looked too, and I saw something move inside the void. Something that hadn't come out yet. Will's hand started slipping. Jonathan, don't let go! I won't! Evelyn screamed the final words of the ritual. Logan carved the last symbol into the floor. The creature let out a sound that was impossible to describe. Not human, not animal, something that burned into my brain. And then, everything exploded into light. The silence was the worst part. A second ago, the castle was collapsing around us. The black abyss was pulsing, ready to swallow us whole. And that thing was screaming in every voice that had ever died there. And then, it was over. The void sealed itself shut, as if it had never existed. The ground beneath our feet stabilized, and the castle fell into a deathly silence. It wasn't relief. It was like the place was waiting. Something had been locked away beneath us. But at what cost? By the time we emerged from the tunnels, the morning sun burned our eyes. I didn't know what time it was. Didn't know how many days we'd spent inside that place. Will said nothing. He just stared at the ground, fingers pressing against the palm of the hand that had nearly been torn off. Logan lit a cigarette. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold the lighter. Evelyn sat on the ground and just stared at the castle. She didn't cry. I don't think she could anymore. No one asked about the bodies we left behind. McNamara, Parker, Wilkins. Their names were etched into my skull. But I knew the truth. There would be no bodies to find. Not after that. 2 days later, Unit Fenrir was officially disbanded. The Wewelsburg tunnels were sealed with concrete. No official explanation. The reports? Burned. What happened in that castle? Never happened. And we all learned not to ask. I never saw Evelyn again after that. She disappeared the following year. Logan left the army and never spoke about that night. Will didn't last long. 6 months later, he shot himself in the mouth. He covered the mirror before he did it. The night before I retired, I was alone in a military barracks in Germany. The radio in my room hadn't worked in years. I never bothered fixing it. But that night, it turned on by itself. Static ripped through the silence, and then a Morse code transmission. 3 words, "We will return." My blood turned to ice. I lunged for the radio, but it was already dead again, as if it had never turned on. I went to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and took a deep breath. And then, I looked in the mirror. My reflection was smiling, but I wasn't.